move to another continent, the continent of Africa. And in Africa, we move to South Africa. What comes to mind? If I go about 30, 40 years earlier, the only thing that comes to mind is apartheid. But of course, the country has come a long way from there. And then of course we have Mandela. And we have the beautiful beaches of South Africa. Who can forget the lovely sanctuaries, the walking with the lion, and much more. The African continent was important to us Indians too, because remember, that's how the Europeans had to come here, past the Cape of Good Hope. I'm saying all this because I want to give you a little idea about the land before I go to the poem. Because the poem is really linked to the land, and one blot on that continent and many countries in that continent. And I am talking about the slave trade. So the poem today is called The Slave Dealer. It's about a person whose business it is to buy and sell slaves. Many of us have heard stories, the torture, the pain, etc. But let's see what Pringle does in this poem called The Slave Dealer. The Slave Dealer by Thomas Pringle, 1789 to 1834. He was a Scottish writer, a poet and abolitionist. Many people consider him to be the father of South African poetry in English. He wrote of the people, the natives, their customs and much more when he talks about the living conditions there. He emigrated to South Africa in 1820. And I want to draw your attention to this particular initiative of the government because they wanted to increase the number of English-speaking people in that area to offset the numbers of the original natives. So he stayed there for some years, but then came back to England. Even when he came back to England, he continued to work on anti-slavery schemes. One of his famous works is called African Sketches, and the other one is Ephemeridis. An interesting poet because he's Scottish born, lived in South Africa, came back to live in the UK, and is deeply involved in anti-slavery ideas and schemes. We have heard and read about slaves. We know of slaves and we know of slave masters. But this poem is called The Slave Dealer. It's about a person who buys and sells slaves, written from his point of view. Let me begin by reading the poem. The slave dealer comes back, meets his mother, and what does he feel? What does he think about the work that he's done? Is he happy? Let's see the poem. From ocean's wave a wanderer came, with visage tanned and dun. His mother, when he told his name, scarce knew her long-lost son. So altered was his face and frame by the ill course he had run. So you have the slave dealer who has come back after many years. And probably so often being out in the sun, we have to imagine the slaves were shipped from Africa and probably to countries in Europe and of course the Americas. So he came back, but he was so tanned, probably he had lost weight and probably there were wrinkles on his face. The poet doesn't tell us all that, but he certainly says that his visage was tanned to such an extent that his mother didn't recognize him. Imagine. There was hot fever in his blood and dark thoughts in his brain. And oh, to turn his heart to good, that mother strove in vain. For fierce and fearful was his mood, racked by remorse and pain. Whatever might be the son's condition, whoever the son may be, whatever may be his actions, I think maternal love continues to be there. So the mother sees that her son is disturbed. Why, she doesn't know, but she does see he's disturbed. And she tries hard to get him out of that feeling of remorse and pain. And if at times a gleam more mild would o'er his features stray, when knelt the widow near her child, and he tried with her to pray, it lasted not for visions wild, still scared good thoughts away. The poem goes on. The mother says, come my dear son, pray with me, you will forget your pain. The son tries, but he does not succeed. And why? Now the son tells us, tells the mother and the reader what it all is about. There's blood upon my hands, he said, which water cannot wash. It was not shed where warriors bled. It dropped from the gory lash. As I whirled it over and over my head, and with each stroke left a gash. You know, there is that pride when you fight for your country and you kill your enemy soldiers. But he says, Mom, it's not that. What is this blood on my hands? And I think of Lady Macbeth when she says, all the perfumes of Arabia cannot wash this smell of blood on my hands. Remember, she had murdered her king and cousin. But let's come back to this slave dealer. What does he have? He says he wielded the whip and the lashes that he gave to that woman. And how did the blood come out? The poet goes on. With every stroke I left a gash where Negro blood sprang high. And now all ocean cannot wash my soul from murderer's dye. Nor even thy prayer, dear mother, quash that woman's wild death cry. It happened some time back, mother, but I'm not able to forget that scene. I'm not able to forget that blood which came out of her body. The blood, her cry, my guilt, Mom, I can't forget it. Her cry is ever in my ear, and it will not let me pray. Her look is, I see her voice, I hear, as when in death she lay, and said, and this is what that dying woman, that slave, that Negro woman said, with me thou must appear on God's great judgment day. She didn't curse me, Mom, she didn't abuse me, but she reminded me that all of us have to face God on judgment day. Now, the mother says, now Christ, from frenzy keep my son, the woeful widow cried. Such murder foul thou hast done, some fiend thy soul belied. And then the son replies, nay, mother, the avenging one was witness when she died. The conversation between the mother and the son is so touching because the son is plagued by guilt and the mother with love for her son and hoping that he will be forgiven. Because penitence are important words in Christian faith. The writhing wretch with furious heel I crush no mortal nigh, but that same hour her dread appeal was registered on high. And now with God I have to deal, and dare not meet his eye. The last verse is said by the son. There was no Satan, Mom, there was no devil in me. I am the culprit, I am the sinner. And after all, God was watching all that I did. And therefore, I can hope for no mercy. And he says, and now with God I have to deal, and dare not meet his eye. I already told you that our poet Pringle was involved in a lot of anti-slavery activities, initiatives. He believed in abolishing the slave trade. And I think this poem is proof of what he believed in. The poem is written in 6-line stanzas. Very simple rhyme scheme as you read the poem. And when I look for figures of speech, I feel like saying the one which keeps coming again and again is alliteration with the sound W. But I want to draw your attention to imagery, the creation of scene after scene. As I read the poem, as I think about the poem, I can't but remember a poet called Phyllis Wheatley. She's supposed to be the first slave woman who turned into poetry, who turned into writing poetry. And when I think of Pringle, with all his initiatives for the abolition of slavery, I think of how on both sides of the line of slaves, slave owners, we have people who believe that it is wrong. Other great African writers too have talked about it. I'm thinking of Alan Paton, for example. So this poem draws attention to something which is probably dead today. I hope it is the slave trade. And makes one think about the pain and misery that these people must have gone through.